Good evening, everybody, and a really warm welcome to the University of York. My name is Professor Kiran Trahan. I'm one of the Pro Vice Chancellors at the University. First of all, thank you so much for giving up your evening on a cold winter's day to be here. This forum is part of the University's Open Lecture Series for the Holocaust Memorial Day. But today feels very important and very significant, and it's so much more than just an annual lecture. As the memory of the Holocaust is soon to pass from our living history, we must never allow it to slip away from our consciousness. We remain deeply grateful to those who have dedicated so much of their lives to sharing these memories with us, and it's our hope that future generations never forget the devastating human cost of the Holocaust. And that's why I'm delighted to have Dr. Rachael Burns talking about this work, but also the things that created that interest and curiosity, for her. Unfortunately, though, we live in a world where horrific cruelty and violence are still perpetuated against people for no other reason than their religion, their race, or their background. As a University of Sanctuary, we want to be a space where those who have had to suffer any form of violence in this way can find a home and safety. Commemorating crimes against humanity that have taken place across time and across the world are therefore integral to reminding us that we must be a place for justice, liberation, and kindness in a world that's so divided and so fractured. Of course, there's always more we can do, and by attending evenings like this, we hope that you will be inspired to further support the work in these areas, as well as continuing the conversation in your own communities. With us tonight is Dr. Rachael Burns, who will be presenting her research on hiding the Holocaust. Rachael started her research on the Holocaust in 2001, when she visited concentration camp. Her studies since have focused on the Holocaust and genocide around the world, and she recognises the importance of education to make a difference. Dr. Burns is passionate about passing on this interest in changing inequalities in the world to her students. In pursuit of this, she's focused her research on the architecture that makes terror palatable, and how the landscape of Nazi concentration camps in Germany changed the perception and memories of the horrors that were happening in plain sight. This talk will conclude with suggestions of how we can use this information to speak out against tyranny and anti-Semitism and challenge misleading rhetoric we are presented with. Welcome, Rachael, and thank you for being here.
To begin with, please allow me to express my gratitude to the University of York for inviting me to speak this evening and for the warm welcome. The theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is Bridging the Generations, and this is a topic particularly close to my heart because it asks us to look forward to the future and consider, as the baton of memorialisation is passed to new generations, and we sadly lose survivors and witnesses to the Holocaust, how we will continue to remember and to speak out against injustice when we see it. What does #NeverAgain really mean to us? Tonight's talk is about the architecture and topography of the concentration camps and how these contributed to denial during the Holocaust. As previously said, in 2001, at the age of 15, I visited Dachau concentration camp on a school language exchange trip. The day was extremely moving, and I spent a large part of it in tears. Half jovially, I often say to people that I walked into the memorial as a horrible teenager, and I walked out a slightly less horrible teenager. I think my parents might have something to say about that one. I vividly remember asking my teachers all sorts of questions as we travelled back to Munich to meet with our billets. But my teachers could not answer my questions. How did this happen, and why did nobody stop it? A little over a year later, I had the opportunity to visit Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau with the Holocaust Educational Trust on their Lessons from Auschwitz programme. I demanded that my teacher give me a place on the course because I was so keen to try and answer some of those questions I had been left with from Dachau. Thankfully, I was granted a place on the programme and off I went to Poland for the day. The experience was profound, and both that day and the day at Dachau shook me to my very core. The trouble was, my questions were still not answered. I looked out from the gates of Birkenau and saw houses in the distance. How did this happen, and why did nobody stop it? So for the last nearly 25 years, I have been trying to answer these questions. Tonight, I am bridging the generations in something of a direct conversation with my teenage self and trying to give some explanation to my questions. Moreover, I am honouring the promise I made all those years ago to keep speaking out and to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. There was on the screen here the QR code. Has anybody been able to log in and put some answers on? A few of you have, okay. So I wanted to ask you, in your mind's eye, what does a concentration camp look like? And let's have a look and see some of those responses. Barracks, a prison camp, unsanitary, exterminating machine, narrow bunk beds, however many people in one bunk, near factories, absolutely. Gas chambers. I think these are some very important and powerful words. But I'm going to take things a little further with this. I'm going to show you some photographs. Perhaps these photographs, taken at Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau in 2002, are not dissimilar from our understanding. Perhaps these are evocative of some of your thoughts as well. The gates, the barbed wire, the barracks, the bars, the guard towers, the expansive and dedicated space for the production of corpses. We may also consider that gas chambers and crematoria feature in our understanding of the Nazi concentration camps. I describe Auschwitz and Birkenau as totems, but these totems are important for our understanding of the Holocaust. Auschwitz and Birkenau are important sites of cultural and collective memory. They stand now as both a memorial and a museum. People from all over the world visit to learn and pay their respects, and they're visited so often that now, if you want to visit, you have to book in advance. We learn about the inhuman conditions in which people existed, the torture they endured, and their ultimate murder. The importance of this site should not be forgotten or underestimated. Our understanding of the Holocaust may come from a number of sources. Perhaps we're privileged to have spoken to survivors, or we may have visited such camps. For me, I think the media plays an important role in our understanding. Some examples here in the top left is a screenshot from the movie Bent, released in 1997. In the top right, a screenshot from La Vita e Bella, also released in 1997. And at the bottom there, Sophie's Choice, released in 1982. Recently, survivor stories have been told to an author who then writes their stories, and they're often written into a book which are titled The Something of Auschwitz, The Tattooist of Auschwitz, The Midwife of Auschwitz, and so on. Documentaries often focus around Auschwitz and Birkenau, But we might also remember contemporary newsreels and documentaries of the liberation of camps, such as Dimbleby's report from Bergen-Belsen, or Edward Ward's report from Buchenwald in 1945. Some camps have gone down in the infernal geography of world history. Theresienstadt and Buchenwald and Auschwitz, etc., Victor Klemperer wrote. And anyone who today commemorates the murder of Jews thinks of the gas chambers in Auschwitz, he went on to say. Scathingly, Cole argued that Auschwitz is to the Holocaust what Graceland is to Elvis. It has become a backdrop to filmic holocausts, a staple of the Holocaust myth. Whether through documentaries, more popular media, or educational resources, a narrative begins to form. Images like Auschwitz itself are transformed into symbolic images and come to signify abstract concepts such as evil, as Judith Kielbach argued. This repetition of the image and totem of Auschwitz have long been criticised by the likes of Judith Kielbach, Marianne Hirsch, and Sybil Milton. These images in our mind are not incorrect, but I would argue that they're not the complete picture. As deep as this scars humanity, the reality is even more frightening. I will argue that the very architecture and topography of the camps promoted the thoughtlessness that Hannah Arendt argued in Eichmann in Jerusalem. Civilians could rationalise away the realities of the camps and continue more readily with their everyday lives. The camps were the very epitome of evil, in that they sprang up in darkness of the totalitarian regime. In so examining the architecture in this way, I challenge how we are educated about the Holocaust. It is desperately important to remember Auschwitz as the site where more than 1 million people were murdered. But the road to the final solution was slow in its progression, and we are missing an important opportunity to educate people on critical thinking if we focus only on the end of the road. It's important to keep in mind that this evening I'm limiting my argument to the concentration camps within Germany as per the borders in January 1933, and not extending my argument into occupied areas. There are 3 key strands to my argument. We need to examine how the concentration camp system in Germany developed over time and consider how this promoted secrecy. We need to examine the architecture of many of the smaller subcamps to understand how these contributed to secrecy. And we need to examine the layout of the larger camps to understand how these contributed to secrecy. Ultimately, given the sheer quantity of Nazi concentration camps and other institutions, such as ghettos, Gestapo prisons, forced labour camps, and so on, it would have been impossible for the wider population to claim that they knew nothing about the Holocaust. Lichtblau in 2013 argued that there were over 50,000 camps in occupied Europe. However, the architecture and topography allowed for a level of plausible deniability to the selves of the civilians. They could pretend to themselves that what they were seeing wasn't reality. Broadly speaking, theoretically, my research explored the Nazi concentration camps through the works of Norbert Elias and Zygmunt Bauman and Abraham de Swan, who bridged the disparities between their arguments. Stanley Cohen's States of Denial was critical to my understanding of the atrocities, but I wanted to explore the physical and psychological sequestration of violence and death, that they were pushed out of sight and out of mind, and to examine how these impacted on civilians' empathy and sympathy towards inmates. But it's the work of Hannah Arendt which I really found particularly pertinent and which I will focus on this evening. For Arendt, totalitarian regimes foster darkness. This darkness is an oppression of our critical thoughts, words, and actions. Over the course of time, Nazism progressed from a political movement to a totalitarian regime and in doing so, systematically instigated moral loneliness and social atomization. It became much harder to speak with your neighbour about your thoughts and your feelings, to question. It shattered the ability for freedom of speech and thought. The people within Nazi Germany were vessels drained of their selves and refilled with Nazi ideologies. They were unable to think for themselves, let alone speak out against a regime. But this did not occur overnight. We may recall the metaphor of the frog, that when dropped in a pot of boiling water, will jump out immediately, for it realises the danger. But if one puts a frog in a pot of cool water and slowly raises the temperature, it won't realise the danger and will slowly boil to death. Germany descended into the darkness of the totalitarian regime as though on a dimmer switch. Over time, the fascist regime took hold and darkness descended. I should also clarify here what I mean by Arendt's term of thinking and thoughtlessness. Faced with a moral dilemma, the individual can choose to accept responsibility for his or her actions, here not helping the lady stand up. They can choose to accept that responsibility, or they can ignore or deny that the problem exists. Thinking, then, is the habit of erecting obstacles to oversimplifications, compromises, and conventions, as Berkowitz argued. The very act of thinking is that silent dialogue with oneself, which allows a person to question if they can bear to live with themselves if they act unethically. To be thoughtless is to do the opposite. For Arendt, it was this thoughtlessness, this banality of evil, that she found so shocking at the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was in charge of the mass transportation of Jewish and other prisoners to concentration camps. Eichmann drew his morality from exterior sources rather than questioning himself. He rationalised his actions to himself in that he was obeying his orders and the Nazi ideology. He never stopped to ask himself if what he was doing was morally right. A key data source for my research was the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, published by the USHMM. Within these volumes, numerous scholars have attempted to catalogue as much known information as possible about the known and legally recognised concentration camps. I drew from these volumes data from each concentration camp in Germany, details such as population numbers within the camps and dates of operation. I sat and read through these volumes. I noticed a peculiar pattern emerging as I did so. Many camps were placed in pre-existing buildings, and the descriptions directly challenged not only my own assumptions of what a concentration camp would look like, but the more sociological understandings posited by the likes of Erving Goffman and Wolfgang Sofsky. Their descriptions missed large swathes of the concentration camp complex. This image here, I appreciate, is quite difficult to see. This is an A0 size piece of paper when printed out. So I'll do my best to try and explain what's going on here. If we examine this document here, this is a timeline of about 500 within my sample, 500 Nazi concentration camps which existed in Germany between 1933 and 1945. Each colour depicts a different purpose of the building prior to it becoming a concentration camp. Over on the left-hand side is 1933, and as we progress through time, it goes to the right to 1945. Purple is the purpose-built camps. Yellow is industrial buildings like factories. Green is civilian buildings, houses, farms, barns, hotels. Blue is military buildings, perhaps these were previous airports or aircraft hangar. Red is fortresses and castles. pink is underground. Orange as well is total institutions other. So these were former prisons or workhouses or psychiatric units, but somewhere where people had been hidden away beforehand. What is particularly striking is the number of camps and how this changes over time. If we look to the left of the timeline, there are comparatively few camps. Moreover, most of these were located in pre-existing buildings. The explosion in the number of camps occurred in 1944 and 1945. I don't know how well you can see from the back, but the long yellow line quite near the top, the yellow, not the orange line, that's actually Dachau concentration camp, which was built in a former brickworks. And we can see this perhaps a little bit more clearly in graph 1, which depicts both the total number of concentration camps in Germany and the changing architecture of the concentration camps throughout the Nazi era. The total number of camps is presented in that dark blue line. The orange line here depicts those which were purpose-built, I think. Sorry, the green line is the purpose-built. And architecturally speaking, matches the totem more readily. But there's also a great number in industrial buildings. Focusing on this graph a little more, we can see with this hump in 1933, 1934, this is the creation of the protective custody camps for political dissenters and political enemies. The majority of prisoners were not imprisoned on the basis of racist pseudoscience, but on politics, the majority of which were in former prisons or fortresses. The number of camps grows steadily with the outbreak of total war, and further after the Wannsee Conference in 1941 and the official instigation of the final solution. The number rises dramatically with the Allied bombings of major cities, but reaches its zenith with the influx of inmates being evacuated into Germany, particularly from the advancing Soviet army in the east. In the same vein, graph 2 depicts the total number of people in Germany who had direct sensory knowledge of the camps. They could see, they could hear, they could smell, potentially even touch some of these camps. The smell from crematoria would travel approximately 20 kilometres. The number remains fairly steady until 1938, after the November pogrom, and there was a slight increase in the number of camps. The number increases slowly up until about 1943 as the war effort really steps up. Until this point in time, the maximum number of people with direct sensory knowledge of the concentration camps peaks at about 16% of the German population. However, it should be noted that around this time, the majority of the camps in Poland were operating and they were operational in the final solution. So much of the final solution was taking place outside Germany. Camps like Treblinka, Sobibor, Helmno were on the other side of Poland, far away from Germany. In 1943, more slave labour was needed in armaments factories. And with the Allied bombing raids on cities, smaller camps were increasingly being placed in larger cities such as Hamburg and Berlin to help with bomb diffusion and cleanup operations. So here the zenith is reached in about 1945. The Allies advancing from both the east and the west forced the Nazis to bring concentration camp inmates into Germany. New camps were created as a place to put these new inmates, but there was a continual need for slave labour in the armaments industry. So at this point, by the end of 1944, beginning of 1945, approximately 30% of the German population, from my sample of 500 camps alone, had direct sensory knowledge of the camps. Considering that German society moved from a fascist totalitarian movement, quite small, into a fascist totalitarian regime with that increase in control, and the impact of this on the ability to think for oneself and to speak out, these graphs make a great deal of sense. For those who weren't indoctrinated into the fascist ideology, they would not have been able to speak out. For those that were indoctrinated, there were further ways that they could rationalise the existence of some of the camps to themselves. And to further explore this and show how the architecture of smaller camps contributed to their secrecy, I'm going to show you some photographs of a few examples of concentration camps and memorials in Germany. This first example is Kranichfeld. This is about 35 kilometres or a 35-minute drive from Buchenwald concentration camp and slightly less to the city of Weimar. Between 1941 and 1945, concentration camp inmates were housed here under atrocious conditions. Details are scant, but we know that they repaired the building, which had caught on fire in 1934, and went on work details in the local town. There was no gas chamber or crematoria, as inmates who worked here, who were worked or brutalised to death, were returned to Buchenwald for their cremation. I visited this site in 2019, and I was surprised that you could get married at this castle. Yeah. A second example is Damsmühle. Here, somewhere between 25 and 40 inmates from Sachsenhausen concentration camp lived here between January 43 and October 44. This property was originally owned by a British industrialist and his Jewish wife, but was confiscated by the Nazis. It was allegedly a base for Reinhard Heydrich, but the inmates who lived in an old outbuilding round the back of the castle and who later built some barracks maintained the ground and worked in the greenhouse and farm to provide produce for the SS main office in Berlin. At times, individual prisoners would be deployed in ditch clearing at the local sawmill. Gunzerode was established in September 1944. Up to 950 inmates lived in a barn and were used as slave labour in laying train tracks nearby. The barn and farm are still in use today, and they are surrounded by many newly built houses. At the time I visited this camp in 2015, there was a very small plaque on the wall to remind me of what this building had previously been. Bayrischl, a subcamp of Dachau, operated in the foothills of the Alps, about 40 miles south of Munich, between November 43 and April 45. The building was a hospital for the recuperation of SS staff, but 10 male inmates worked in this camp. And when I went to look at this building in 2019, it was a youth hostel. Again, with a very small plaque to memorialise it outside. This is a very small sample of some of the camps that I've been to visit. In the top left here, we see Bleicherode, which was a former hotel. There were 12 Italian prisoners of war who were kept in the basement. It's now a community centre. When I went there in 2015, there were salsa classes taking place. In the top right is Grosswerther. This used to be a former inn before it became a concentration camp. In the bottom left is Elrich Juliushutte, different from the other camp of Elrich, which was nearby. But the camp here was in the annex of a restaurant, which has since been destroyed. And in the bottom right is the entrance to Fuhlsbüttel prison up in Hamburg, which was a prison before the Nazi era, a prison during the Nazi era, and remains a prison to this day. For the purposes of reparations, legally speaking, all of these were concentration camps. Don't be fooled by the outward architecture. What was taking place inside was just as brutal as any other camp. So what is particularly striking for me about these camps is their outward architecture. In comparison to the earlier images of Auschwitz and documentary footage of concentration camps, there was very little out of the ordinary in their outward appearance. Indeed, several were very difficult to find during fieldwork. These are only a small sample of the wider picture, and to some extent I've deliberately chosen those photographs to highlight their normality to you. So I posit that part of the reason why some people felt they could say that they didn't know about the concentration camps was because a significant number looked like ordinary buildings. But returning to particularly some of the larger main camps, we can consider how the topography, the layout of the camps may have contributed to a degree of secrecy. And taking the camp of Gross Rosen as an example, this map shows the final layout of the camp in 1945. If we have a look here, is my thing going to work? Technology fail. Here we go. Okay, we're going to do it without that. On the right of this image, if you can see where the garage is, that line down there, that's the main road. And behind that you have the SS camp, the administration blocks, the SS blocks where the SS were housed. And it's behind that that you have the entrance, that you have the main gate, which says Arbeit macht frei. Behind that you have the roll call square, you have the barracks for the prisoners. Behind that you have the quarantine and the jail, where the most ill prisoners would have been kept, and in the jail where so many would have been tortured. Behind that is the new camp, and this was created much later. This was in about 1944. But right in the centre, at the back there, you can see the gas chamber, the crematoria, and a site of execution. Hidden right at the very back, or once more of the camp was built, right in the very centre. And it would have been very difficult, if any civilians were nearby, to have witnessed that. Not wishing to suggest that they didn't know, as I said, the smell from the crematoria alone could travel up to 20 kilometres. But there's a level of plausible deniability here. It's very difficult to try and depict this on a 2D map because we've also got the quarry there at the top, which is where thousands died in the atrocious conditions and the slave labour that took place there. But that's sort of up on an incline. So I'm going to try and show you some photographs of this to try and explain the layout a little more. If you can imagine, this photograph was taken with my back to the camp, looking left up the main road. Not really a lot to see, is there? So again, civilians might not have seen an awful lot. This is looking directly out from the camp. Again, very rural, no buildings, not a lot of civilians around there. And looking to the right, that sign for Gross Rosen would not have been there. That's been in place with it as a memorial. And then I've turned round. This is looking directly up to the main gate from that main road. And you can see how far away that main gate is to Gross Rosen. The prisoners would have been behind that gate, and this area here, which is now a car park, would have been where the SS buildings were, acting as something of a visual shield. And up to the right would have been where the quarry was. Beyond this, there's multiple examples of this sort of topography at other concentration camps. Another one not far from Berlin is Ravensbrück, which was predominantly for female prisoners. There were some male prisoners as well. This photograph I took with my back to the gas chambers and the crematoria, looking out to the nearest town. And I specifically took this photograph with, I'm told, the correct focal length. So this is how it would appear to the human eye if you were stood there. And you just about maybe see that there's a town in the distance. But again, it would have been very difficult for people to visually see what was happening. Off to the right of that photograph is also where the SS barracks would have been, again, as a kind of physical, visible shield for civilians if they came nearby. And another example of this is at Flossenbürg. The little white building that you can hopefully see in the middle is the crematorium. And this is at the very, very back of the camp, down a slope. So the barracks, all the buildings where people were, where they lived, any camp kitchens, any S barracks were far in front of this. And this was really hidden out of the way at the back, as you can see, surrounded by trees, which were extant at the time as well, to really shield this place from sight. So again, they're making use of the landscape, whether it's trees, whether it's water, whether it's the natural inclines in the land. These were used to really disguise some of the most dirty, some of the most disgusting things that we find within society, death and violence. These don't generally happen out in public, and where they can, often they're pushed behind the scenes, out of sight and out of mind. Again, Flossenbürg was a particularly interesting one for me in terms of what it looks like now. In the foreground is where the foundations of barracks would have been. And you can see houses built now, which people do live in. And those houses were not in existence at the time. There were barracks there for inmates. And those houses have been built since. In fact, one camp, a very small sub-camp that I went to, some of the barracks were being lived in as houses. They'd been converted into houses, which was interesting to see. And just as a last point on the topography of main camps and architecture within the main camps, I took this photograph actually at Stutthof, which is just outside of Gdansk. And this barbed wire fence that you can see here, to the right of that is where the gas chamber and crematoria were, and to the left is where the rest of the main camp was. And what was fascinating to me is the direction in which the barbed wire goes. It's not to keep people in, to prevent them from escaping. It's actually seemingly to keep people out. It'd be much harder to climb over that, to climb in, to perhaps destroy the crematoria, than it would be to climb out. So again, all this secrecy that's built into the architecture and topography. As I analysed the timelines, the graphs, the photographs, indeed as I stood at the site of some of the worst atrocities in the 20th century, I came to see these camps as the epitome of wolves in sheep's clothing. I considered them against the backdrop of Arendt's work and realised the concentration camp system was the manifestation of her concepts of evil. Between 1933 and 1945, Germany developed from a fascist movement to a fascist totalitarian regime. And as the darkness of this totalitarian regime drew in ever closer and the potential for speaking out and illuminating the darkness became more difficult, so too did the number of camps increase. And their architecture developed into the menacing imagery we envisage today. Arendt analogized the radical evil brought about in a totalitarian regime as like a fungus, roots penetrate deep into the earth, but fungi lacks depth. The analogy with darkness stands if we use the metaphor of fungi. Both fungi and the concentration camp system can only grow in the darkest of conditions, and also where there is the most breakdown. The concentration camp system grew slowly and steadily, initially positively presented to the wider German population. Indeed, the town of Dachau next to the camp of Dachau were very pleased with some of the economic benefits that initially came round before it got a bit of a bad name. Towards the end of the war, when they were speaking with American soldiers, they were less pleased, it would seem, from the evidence. By the time of the Wannsee Conference in 1941, and by the time of the true horrors of the final solution that were being realised, the darkness and the oppression was such that the wider population could not speak out, even if they thought to do so. In the absolute darkness of the final months of the Nazi era and total war, the explosion in the number of camps was possible. Darkness has arrived when the public voice neither speaks out nor questions their oppressors. The truth is degraded to meaningless triviality and swept under the carpet under the pretext of upholding old truths, Arendt wrote. By locating camps in outwardly seemingly innocuous buildings, civilians were able not to think too deeply about the realities therein. This capacity not to think returns us to the concept of the banality of evil. Just as Eichmann was devoid of thought for the moral consequences of his deeds, it was made possible for the nearby civilians to remain thoughtless if they chose to do so. Civilians could rationalise away the realities of the concentration camps on their doorsteps. The visibility of the camps, in that they were in the facade of an ordinary building, allows for a psychological distancing and for the ordinary German populace to live a lie. It's easy to judge the Nazi era through a 21st century lens where information about global affairs is readily available at our fingertips. We can learn about global affairs around the clock, and this information is readily available and accessible on the internet. So too, we can speak out on social media. But in a post-9/11 world, in our democratic society, we face unprecedented attacks on our civil liberties by our own governments, with the likes of the Patriot Act and the Terrorism Act. Post-2016, the term fake news is bandied about. In the 2020s, we've seen an unprecedented threat to democracy, particularly in the USA, and our rights to peaceful protest are being eroded. My greatest fear is that we are sleepwalking towards another era of great darkness. All too readily, people believe what is written on the side of a bus. We eat up rhetoric and spin about making a country great again more readily than the possibility that anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, amongst others, that are prevalent in our countries. Auschwitz as a totem of the Holocaust is important in that it represents the ultimate horror of man's inhumanity to man, but this site of genocide did not spring up overnight. Equally important, the Holocaust did not just happen over there, but scattered throughout Europe and under the very noses of civilians. The Holocaust was hidden in plain sight. It was the elephant in the room. Perhaps you noticed our very own elephant in the room? Not on that slide. Go back one. Our very own elephant in the room. It was there all along, but did you see it? Did you really see it? And were you really questioning? I kind of hoped somebody would go, Rach, why is there an elephant on your slide? Pedagogically, Auschwitz is desperately important. We need to learn the ultimate cost and destination of racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. But perhaps now more than ever, the smaller subcamps, those hidden in plain sight, are important too. We can see how the Holocaust progressed, how civil liberties were eroded, and how ordinary citizens were able to avert their eyes to reality, clinging to these old truths. And we can educate and inform young people on the very real dangers of totalitarianism and racism. The possibility for great darkness is just as prevalent and just as pervasive today as it was in the 1930s. Collectively, we have a responsibility to look behind the thin veil and to really think and to speak out, to illuminate in that darkness. It's a great privilege to work for a university which prides itself on working for the public good and empowering my students to speak at any injustice is my very reason for being. As I mentioned at the start, my speaking here this evening is part of my ongoing promise to keep speaking about the Holocaust and challenging prejudice and hatred. Tomorrow evening, on the 27th of January at 8 p.m, as part of the National Holocaust Memorial Day, 81 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, you are warmly invited to join me and so many others around the country by lighting a candle and placing it in your window in memory of those who were murdered for who they were, and stand against prejudice and hatred today. I invite you to also light the darkness. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to open it up for questions, but before I do, I want to say a couple of words in reflection. Thank you for speaking. Thank you for speaking out. But most of all, thank you for shining a light in the darkness.
Thank you.
Because is it ever more needed than it is now? And on that note, I want to open it up for questions, but could I ask if you would like to ask a question or share a reflection, if you could just raise your hands, but if you could just wait till the mic gets to you, otherwise we won't always hear it down here or on the recording. So I'm going to just open it up for observations, questions or reflections. Thank you. Just one down at the bottom here.
Thank you. That was very interesting and illuminating. I certainly learned a lot about how much more widespread the structures of the Holocaust were. But I'm just wondering, what are we to make of Gaza? It's not that it is in plain sight but hidden. It's in plain sight and it's in plain sight. But the world has largely remained silent apart from a few words, newspaper headlines and so on.
Yeah.
Is there something about the way the world has changed that we have been deadened by the notion of fake news, for example, that we think perhaps it hasn't really happened? I'd just be interested in your reflections on that.
Oh, ask a difficult question. I don't think society, in that sense, ever did change. There's such a thing as compassion fatigue, where people will move from one tragedy to the next and be moved by the next tragedy that comes along, while the initial tragedy is still taking place. People have been denying atrocities for millennia. So in some respects, I don't think that the humanitarian crisis that's happening in Gaza is unusual in society's response to it. However, I do think we have a responsibility to speak out, as I say, to injustice where we see it. While the State of Israel has an absolute right to defend herself within her borders, I think we do have to speak out when beyond that. And I think it's disappointing that we don't get to as much.
Great, thank you. And there's a question at the And then I'll come to you next. And I'm just raising for a question down here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your informing talk. I also have been to Dachau well before you were born, perhaps. I come from an Arab heritage where my ancestors, the relevant ones as well as the distant ones, have opened their hearts and shared whatever they had with the Jews who were again kicked out of Europe. I was disappointed in your answer to the gentleman down there when you said that the Israelis have the right to defend themselves. In Gaza and in the West Bank, they are still occupying force and they have no right. So you are wrong in assuming that.
I was
Right?
specifically speaking within their borders, within their
That land,
recognised,
that
legally
land,
recognised borders.
the recognized one and the occupied one, they have no right to terrorize the civilian population until this very moment in the West Bank.
I agree.
Thank you very much for agreeing. The third point is you failed to mention Islamophobia in all the words that you have.
Yes, I did, didn't I? I apologise.
Yes, you did. Thank you for accepting that as well. And the fourth
No, thank
and
you for
final
raising
one,
it.
No, well, it's all right. It hurts me also as, and by the way, I have worked in this university and served for over half a century.
Wow.
Anyway, as a student and then graduating as a professor. But the last one is what hurts me most is when people talk about anti-Semitism. And I challenge the population occupying Palestine today to show me with DNA who is the Semite, us or them, and particularly the Palestinian people. They are the true Semites. So using the word anti-Semitic, they are denying the Palestinians in the first place, but also Arabs of their heritage. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for your comments there. It's interesting what you were saying about borders and occupied territory. I agree with you there. And thank you for raising, yeah, you're right, I did miss out Islamophobia, and I apologise wholeheartedly for that. And for your third point there, sorry, there's a lot of very important points. Can you refresh me on your third point?
Well, the anti-Semitism?
The differences there of...
DNA. If they want to challenge it, even I challenge people, and many of my very close Jewish friends agree with me on that. I'm more Semite than the others. It's a fact. I mean, if we are to get a criminal nowadays, we say DNA. Here it is. I'm willing to challenge on that. But the use of the word anti-Semitism is silencing criticism. I mean, even the IHRA definition is most appalling, even by the person who have put it forward as a point of discussion. Today, it is law. You cannot criticize Israel, otherwise you will be anti-Semitic, which is, again, a false accusation.
You might be interested to look at the Jerusalem Declaration.
I've looked at that, and I'm in favor of it, actually.
Great, thank you. I want to try and take as many questions as I can, and I want to go to the young person in the room, which is lovely to have, and for their question or reflection. Thank you.
Did you actually answer your questions which you have asked yourself when you were 15?
No.
Do you think you will answer them?
No. I think I can answer them in part for myself to when I was that age. But to be honest, I still have so many questions. It's always going to be an incomplete picture. I don't think I can ever fully comprehend what happened there. It would be too horrific, as hard as I try. And I will keep continuing to try. I will keep continuing to read and study as long as there is air in my lungs. But I'm going to keep reading and keep speaking out where I can.
Do you think anyone will ever answer these questions?
It's difficult to think of people as experts on this because there are so many realities in this. There are people who were present within the camps who have their lived experiences of this. There are people who have lived experiences of being maybe a perpetrator and some of the actions that they took part in. I think the last person to read every book published on Earth was Erasmus, and he's long dead. I think that was like in the 1500s. I like to think that people will keep reading and keep finding out more. And like I said, I'm going to keep trying. It's a good question. I like that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for... it's not easy to sort of want to kind of ask questions, and particularly when you're young in a room full of, you know, slightly more grown-up people. So thank you.
Come and study sociology or criminology when you come to do undergraduate, and we'll try and figure it out.
And then maybe one day you'll be up on this stage helping us find an answer, which would be wonderful.
Absolutely.
Question over here.
The Nazis you've shown were hiding what they were doing. Presumably that means they had some idea that what they were doing is wrong, because what you don't think is wrong, you don't try and hide. Does that mean that genocides now are in some sense different because people are not hiding them? They are, and it's been talked about the genocide in Gaza as the first live streamed genocide. Does that make a moral difference in what is happening?
Oh, does it make a moral difference? Every genocide is different. I don't think you can ever or should ever compare one to another. The genocide in the Holocaust, the genocide in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Darfur, what's happening in Gaza at the moment. They're all different in their own way. It's interesting that you say they must have thought that there was something wrong if they had to hide it. The mass murder of people with disabilities was actually protested against. Particularly a priest who spoke out about this and his congregation about what was happening. And they sort of quelled it a little, hid it more behind the scenes before really going back to it. And so I think they realised that early on, jumping into something like the final solution, it would have taken time to build that ideology up within people. I don't think they would have gotten away with it in the same way. But I think we need to think longer term with what's happening in the world at the moment. I think it's important to think not just in weeks or months or years, but decades. And how some of the thinking around there has been going on for decades.
Thank you, Rachel. Any other questions or reflections? Okay, so I'm going to go to the back there first, and then to the gentleman in the blue that's just put his hand up there. So if we go there and there. Thank you. Oh, sorry, did I miss you? No, my apologies. Let's go there while you've got the mic. We'll go there and then there. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to talk about the importance of education and how it grows and how these things grow in the wrong soil over time. And it was very striking. When I was in Berlin a few years ago, we saw the empty bookshelves at Humboldt University as a great testimony, another very haunting image of the Holocaust story. These ignorance where the books were burned, I believe in 1933-34, and that was really preparing the soil for everything that followed. And it's a cause for alarm now that recent figures suggest in such an age of instantaneous fake news, ill-grounded research and the news coming through our devices rather than the written page, claiming that up to a third of under 25s in the country have never read a book without really prepared, well-nourished information coming to people. It is a real cause for alarm, particularly as I say, with the trends going that way and populist politicians are becoming more popular. Yeah.
I think that's a very fair reflection. Under 25s, has anybody read a whole book? Thank you, that's good to know.
Okay, we're going to have a question from there, and then we'll come back to this end of the room, and then down here in the corner.
I was going to thank you for the talk, and just to say, a couple of years ago I went to Sachsenhausen, and the thing that struck me then was when you arrive, and it was like your picture, it looked like a really pleasant place. I thought, oh, this doesn't look too bad. And then you get in, and you sort of see the horror. But my question really was more about whether you thought the people, all these people you said were in contact with the camps, do you think they were in denial or actually seeing something very different? And I'm loath to draw too many parallels with what's going on in the US right now. But it's interesting with the shootings in Minneapolis that we can see what we've seen on TV, but you will get people on the other side who say, I see protesters attacking ICE agents. And I think some of them are making it up, but I think some of them believe it. They're just seeing it as sort of almost a different reality. And I just kind of wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I didn't have time to fully go into that aspect of the research that I did. But one of the things that I did look at beyond the buildings was within the archives of civilian testimony and what they had to say. And what I found was the closer they were to any of the people who were prisoners, sort of psychologically, literally physically, if they had to maybe work alongside them in maybe some of the factories, they had a deeper level of sympathy for them. And that they saw them more as saw their shared humanity. And I think it's really important that just because somebody doesn't look like you or doesn't necessarily have all the same beliefs as you or thinks the same way as you on some things, you still got to see the shared humanity in people. It's when you cease to do that that they become much easier to other. And so I think it's very interesting with what's happened with the ICE. I'm loath to draw some parallels, but at the same time, the two people, particularly recently, and I say two, there's been a lot more, but the two that have been particularly famous recently, you will notice white. And what about all those others who've been murdered who weren't white? And it becomes much easier to empathise, to see ourselves in their shoes, to think about their families, because if they look like us, then it's much easier to. So, yeah, there's a whole other section of the research that I couldn't go into tonight.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Rachel. I'm going to go in the corner, back down here, and then in the corner over there.
Thank you, very interesting. Two questions. The first one is, in one of the images of the camps you showed was the Siemens factory, and then you referenced about the use of labour in a lot of the smaller examples you gave. And so the question is, how complicit was industry in the Holocaust?
Oh, very.
And the second part of the question is, after a short time, things were put to bed and we didn't chase down the perpetrators of the Holocaust for the good of the economy and the threat from the East. So how do you feel about that, and how, when you reflect on that second part, what's your view on that?
Oh gosh. Well, firstly, yes, industry was certainly profited. and a lot of individuals profited from slave labour as well, as you said about the Siemens factory. All sorts of businesses did. As for now, I mean, would I boycott certain companies? I think that might be challenging to do. There were so many. Now, am I more likely to boycott a company that's behaving in an unethical manner? I think I'd certainly try. Does that answer your question? That's my personal choice. It's up to you however you want to behave in your lives. I'm not going to tell you how to think.
It was less about avoiding that, but about, you were saying about hiding in plain sight, and the gentleman also said about, you know, the awareness of what was going on. That meant that there must have been hundreds of thousands and millions of people who were exposed to it,
who were
because they
alongside.
were seeing that labour being used.
Yeah.
And then you have afterwards the, I don't want to say collective amnesia, but it was sort of like that. Okay, well, we need to forget this because we need to move on and protect ourselves. That creates a conflict, and it allows people to salve their consciences because, okay, everybody else is doing it.
It's actually very interesting to travel around Germany and to consider the difference between what was East Germany and what was West Germany, and memorialisation practices after the war. In former East Germany, there seems to be a lot more memorials, a lot more of the buildings were commemorated. There might be a plaque somewhere. Travelling around what was West Germany, significantly fewer. A lot more of the buildings have been razed, and there isn't any remains left of those buildings. And so a lot of people did work alongside, whether they were forced labour or whether they were working as general civilians within industry. A lot of people were working alongside inmates, but I was specifically talking about the camps themselves, but a lot of people were, and a lot of people, as I say, profited. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Question here, and then I'm going to go to the question at the end there. Thank you.
Do you think that the way that the Holocaust has been taught and thought about since the end of the war, it's kind of cemented in a lot of people's minds that that is what a Holocaust genocide looks like, and that can then detract from more modern, current Holocaust and genocides, so that people don't see them as the same because they don't look, they've not got the barbed wire camps, they've not got the people in the uniforms, and they've not got the crematoriums. So people don't see them as being as serious.
I think there is a big problem in the labelling of genocide more broadly, and often a reluctance to label as something as a genocide when it is taking place. And I've been very critical of the UN for that, and how its definition is being applied. The definition can be, in some respects, very easily applied to a lot of different conflicts that have taken place around the world, but whether or not it has been or will be by courts is another matter. I don't know if people necessarily expect the barbed wire. Like I say, it's very difficult to compare and contrast. You know, how can I compare the Holocaust to Cambodia or Rwanda? I can't, and I won't, because they're all individual, they're all different, and they're all tragic in their own truly horrific ways. But I think it's more about noticing and labelling. I mean, how many deaths does it take for a genocide to be called a genocide? I can't answer that, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. And then one final question at the end here. Oh, just sorry, I'll come back to you 1 second.
Thank you. I think the main point you're making, I think, has been around the gradual acclimatisation to what, to begin with, may have appeared entirely unacceptable, with your analogy of the frog, and that gradual movement. What though, I find quite surprising is that there was that massive increase at the end, at a time when Germany was under such enormous pressure, and the amount of resource that was obviously going to be required to be diverted to managing that at a time you would have thought all resource was needed to defend the nation. That I find a bit hard to comprehend, why so much resource had to be diverted to managing this process of extermination as opposed to fighting the war. And I can't really make sense of that. Can you cast any light on that?
A lot of the camps, particularly those in the big cities, were using slave labour for clearing up bombs, for diffusing bombs where they had dropped, all the clean-up operations where the bombing had taken place. So they were using the slave labour in that respect. They weren't necessarily building new gas chambers or crematoria at any of these sites. These were specifically to house the slave labour, but also that putting camps very near to armaments works, so that there was an increase in people in slave labour next to those armaments factories. So that's a big reason for why. The movement in from the east and from the west towards the end of the war as the Allies were coming in, but also for that, the use of slave labour either for clearing up in bombings, diffusing bombs, or for working in the armaments industry. Does that help to answer your question?
I think it's some of it, but obviously when you look at Auschwitz, that wasn't the case. I mean, there was some armaments there, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
There was still, the SS was significantly diverted toward the process of extermination.
Yeah.
And, from the moment people arrived there. So it wasn't like there was use of those people. A significant proportion were diverted immediately from any source of work. Yes, some people were in that way. So it does seem to me very hard to understand why that was the main focus. But the overall point about the gradual assimilation and what you find acceptable on a gradual basis obviously has resonances now, and as you were alluding to the American situation, and where the pronouncements coming from the administration reflect a narrative that is hard to comprehend when you look at the video. But if you take away that video, if you didn't have that, if you just had the narrative, people would say, well, this is what the government is saying, it's acceptable. So the video journalism seems to me quite an important factor in this now, because it does give an immediate and different narrative. But against that, you have a very strong narrative still coming down saying what you're seeing, don't believe it, don't trust it. And I don't know how it's going to work out in the end, this, because there's a different perspective on both sides, and a lot of people will still believe.
I think it's interesting the point he made about towards the end of the war and why they still carried on, that virulent anti-Semitism continuing. I think it was in Norbert Elias's book, and he talks about towards the end of the war that the Germans very much had their backs to the wall. And if you think, I think he uses the metaphor, if I remember correctly, of like a caged animal, and that when its back is to the wall, it's more likely to keep lashing out in that way, that society had broken down so much that they might as well carry on and be even more vicious. It's horrendous that they carried on. I don't have a good answer for that, but I think the point you made about like the news and the media, we need to keep questioning some of what we hear, and to keep telling others to keep questioning what they hear on the news, and in wider society.
Thank you. And then the final question from the...
I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on the use of propaganda during the Nazi regime, on how they portrayed the Jews as someone to blame for World War One, and how they used that maybe to make the people of Germany think that the Holocaust was a good thing. Maybe they didn't try to hide it when they showed it through the propaganda, because you can see how the use of propaganda influenced things like Kristallnacht, for example. And I wanted to know what your thoughts on about how the use of propaganda might have influenced people, maybe not denying the Holocaust, but accepting it.
Propaganda was huge, and there was a level of positive propaganda and negative propaganda. So there was a lot of negative propaganda, stereotyping Jewish people and what had taken place, you say, about the end of the First World War and blaming Jewish people for that. There was also that level of positive propaganda to uplift the Aryan person, the blonde-haired, the blue-eyed individual, promoting this sort of strong, blonde, brusque man, and this sort of, I don't know, voluptuous, blonde-haired with the braids type woman as being these ideal. She'd go out and have 10 children. You got a medal if you had 10 children in your lifetime in Nazi Germany. But there was I think you're right to draw attention to the amount of propaganda. And it was happening all over the place. There was also propaganda around the camps. So there was a camp in what is now the Czech Republic, just outside of Prague, called Theresienstadt or Terezín. And at the time that inmates lived there, some might describe it as a ghetto, some might describe it as a concentration camp. But when people were housed there, the Red Cross wanted to go in and to explore it, to see exactly what was happening in a camp like Theresienstadt. And the Nazis filmed a propaganda film, and they filmed people taking part in theatrical performances, eating their dinner, seemingly having a lovely time. There were flowers planted in the window boxes, and it was all an absolute and utter load of rubbish. The children that they gave these pieces of bread to and said, oh, we want you to eat these on camera, they had to keep giving them more bread because the children were so hungry that they were eating it before they could switch the camera on. It was a massive piece of propaganda that they tried to make, and they actually tried to make it look so nice that they realised they couldn't show it to the wider German population because it made the lives of the Jewish people there look too good. So ultimately they couldn't show it. There was a lot of propaganda in the early days about the camps, and that they were protective custody, that they were there for political opponents. But ultimately that drip, drip, drip feeding over centuries. We think about the historic anti-Semitism that was taking place as well, not just during the Nazi era. That had already been going on for so long. And then you're getting all of this pumped at you from Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. It would be absolutely horrendous. I think the propaganda would have been desperately important for helping to pump that ideology into people, to fill them up with that ideology.
Thank you for a really brilliant question to end this session on. Colleagues, friends, before we go, I just want to say, first of all, a huge thank you to you, the audience, for coming tonight, but for engaging so thoughtfully and so reflectively, and also sharing the challenges and the experience that you bring. To Rachel, I hope we always shine a light on the darkness, and thank you for the work that you do and continue to do in making a difference and asking us to make a difference, Rachel. Thank you. And then just before we go, and we've literally only got a couple of minutes, I'd just like to introduce you to Professor Pike, who's just going to introduce another book that is really important on the very sort of topics that we've been talking about. But we literally have only got a couple of minutes.
This report's work, independently of the work done by Rachael Burns, for which I am very grateful. Hiding the Holocaust is the title. You can bury it as you bury Nanking, Ukraine, Armenia, Cambodia, etc. Never again, say the gravestones. Unless, and I and 2 others have been writing a book analysing the motives that underlie all these disasters, looking at the social structure, the various kinds of branding which include anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, ageism, misogyny, all have a similar structure. And to deal with this, we look at the cause of these differentiations. We call them harmage, harm resulting from prejudice, the origin and the process by which it happens, and the need for the action that we need to deal with this by the education to allow people to see the signs of this coming. And we do this by having collected stories from a wide variety of different kinds of harm that has been caused, looking at the model of this process of harmage, and to lead from there to the styles of education which encourage questioning, not just taking the answers, but discovering why. And we have had some experience in schools in London and in Germany. We combine theory with practice, and we've published a book. 3 authors: Agnes Kaposi, who was in the Holocaust herself. One of the final stages was the Holocaust in Hungary that had originally sided with Germany, but then defected. Anja Balis, German. Her grandparents were involved on the German side in the Holocaust, and she is reconciling with that, focusing on education. Me, University of York. I have the book, which we have written over the last 2 years to be published by Springer, and I already have obtained from Springer the preprint, which is all the text, but it's on a computer form, not on paper. The preprint is now available, costs nothing. When the book comes, it'll cost about £30. So that's the cost of putting it onto paper. The book is called Harmage and Hope. It describes this theory of harm and education for building hope. There's that's a picture of it. That's it. Can we go back, because it's got the email address on? So if you send a request, harmageandhope@cantab.net, you'll be taken to a link that gives you the preprint. It's 300 pages. It's not easy reading. Please find it, read it, and act upon it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's a great note to end on purpose and hope. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.